Hello and welcome to this week's review of My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing the episode titled Quirk Explosion. And we kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives and the headline positives. All the big things I'm discussing over the course of this review. I loved getting the backstory of All For One, as well as the insights into the Quirk emergence time period. The animation, the design work was as fantastic as ever, and I liked how it ended for reasons which we'll get onto shortly. So, here we are. All For One has been hoisted by his own petard, which is doubly apt seeing as a petard was a small explosive. He was consumed by his own hubris, and now he is no longer of this world, which means we've got two villains in two separate series, in two separate videos that I've covered over the past year who've ultimately gone out the same way, which is wild when you think about it, but nonetheless, let's get into the review, and I suppose that I should have known this was going to be the episode where All For One was going to snuff it in the end, because this episode starts out and most of the runtime is taken up by that flashback sequence, which, as I've learned over recent times in my time starting to cover and talk about anime and such, that's usually a sign that a character is going to die, because God forbid we learn about a character's backstory ahead of time to get us more invested in them, but hey ho, that's the path we find ourselves on. But nonetheless, I enjoyed learning about the backstory of All For One. Whilst it was brief, it was a dark and bloody one, and as dark as bloody as one would expect. I will admit that in certain elements it was starting to reach near farcical levels, but nonetheless it was well presented, as it gives us a fantastic look into the early days of the Quirk emergence period, and gives us an explanation as to how these things were seen. I find it amazing that at the end of the day, All For One was bad to begin with. On the one hand, having a villain that is just evil, just outright evil in a series where all our villains are ultimately victims of circumstance and society is itself a refreshing change. All our villains, there's an argument you really can't call them villains, or at least the vast majority of them that we know the backstory of, because at the end of the day, like I say, they're more victims of circumstance and the society surrounds them. They've been shaped and moulded by life experiences to put them down the dark path that they are on, and that for the sake of someone reaching out to them or just nudging them on a slightly different path, they might not have become villains at all. Hell, some of them might well have become heroes, or at the very least lived a quiet and modest life, and here that isn't the case with All For One. Now, of course, some will argue that he isn't just evil, that he wasn't necessarily bad to begin with, because he could sense how his mother was being treated whilst he was in the womb, and that began to twist him and turn him into the evil person that he would ultimately end up being, which, I will admit, it feels like a bit of a stretch to go down that path, particularly bearing in mind that he does end up killing his mother, and he's somehow able to stain himself and his younger brother through the first formative years of their life when they're at the most vulnerable, but hey-ho, these are the memories of a murderous psychopath who wants to rule the world after reading stuff he saw in old comic books, so maybe there is more to this than we saw, or maybe there is just more to this than we end up seeing, regardless of whether it's in the anime or the manga. There was other elements within his backstory that he himself did not see relevant to reflect back upon, and the whole affair of him getting to a point that he could actually walk and talk was just as bloody and messed up as everything we've seen up until that point. I mean, even if there isn't more to this backstory than we ended up seeing, what we still saw of it was bloody messed up and was perfectly horrible. Like, it was meant to be creepy, it was meant to make you feel uncomfortable, and it largely does that. I will admit that I'm a bit mixed on the idea that AFO, All For One, was bad to begin with, because I don't think it necessarily works narratively speaking. Because at the point in history that we're seeing, quirks are new. They're still known as meta abilities. They're unknown, they're scary, and the science behind them is just as bad then as seemingly is in the time of My Hero Academia's main timeline. There's a lot of theorising as to how it came to be in existence, and that, oh, it is created via disease, which itself, like they say in this episode, only makes things worse, and it only creates a greater divide between those with meta abilities and those that aren't, and this leads to bands of thugs getting ready to beat and murder those with quirks. Had he not been evil to begin with, you could make the argument ultimately he ended up going down this path because he lived in a dark world where he was seen as a demon, so he became the Daemon Lord that he saw in his comic books. but he is just unrepentantly evil. A greedy and destructive force from womb to tomb, and a self-destructive one at that, as we end up seeing in the latter half of this episode. Everything with All For One is everything you could possibly want from a dark and twisted backstory for a villain who is just a villain. Logical gaps notwithstanding. It creates some of the darkest images that we've seen in this series just outright. I know we've had equally troubling stuff as we saw with the backstory with Tomura, but here it is just so twisted, strange, uncanny, and unpleasant. There is this nightmarish quality to it. All For One is the dark manifestation of a dark period in this world's history. He is the brutality and the inhumanity of humanity personified. He is a devil to punish mankind for being so heartless. We see just how twisted and nasty this period in history is. Everything is drab, everything is broken, and in some regards those visual images and signifiers echo through to the present day within the series itself. This world, in this current moment, in the present, is going through another period of change, or at least it is in Japan. And what comes on the other side of that is yet unwritten. Even if our heroes do win it, there's no guarantee that we go back to necessarily a world where things were good like before or better. We learn that All For One and his brother were twins. Now, in some folklores and superstitions, there are mysteries and darkness and odd things surrounding twins to begin with, and I imagine that's part of the reason why they did this with this particular story. Making them twins ends up playing into that fact. And an interesting fact, the whole thing about one twin stealing nutrients from the other, that is something that can happen with twins. I know someone who, they were supposed to be twins, but they absorbed the other twin. So, yeah, that kind of stuff can happen, as weird and strange as it can be. It's a thing. It's a real thing. It's a dark, weird thing. And this is just another reflection of just how strange all this can be. His brother kept trying for years to try and turn All For One around, to make him a better person, try and usher him away from his dark and murderous ways. But he was never able to do so, as is bloody evident. All For One, almost from the moment he was born, was just driven to become evil and dark and nasty. And in the end, All For One ends up killing his brother when he tries to flee and tries to become his own person, when he tries to slip through his control. From the moment he was born, All For One has wanted control over anyone and everything around him. And if he can't get that control, he just destroys whatever's in his path. And when we end up seeing more of this backstory, we end up seeing him destroying his own brother, it just ends up illustrating that Hubris is a major character flaw of his. Yes, I would have liked this to have been shown more throughout the series, but if you'd have done that, that would end up making him seem less like the big evil mastermind that's behind everything, and more like a Saturday morning cartoon villain. Like there was always this case of, yes, everything's going according to plan. And then, as is a way to these things, things don't go to plan. It would have made him seem impotent. And that's one thing, but of course the argument is also could be made that by just having it being shown now that Hubris is a major character flaw of his, it almost is an attempt to justify him going down in the way that he does do. But I'm okay with it, because at the end of the day, having this being a core element of his character does play into his desire to be the evil Daemon Lord from the comic book, because in comic book logic, those kind of bad guys are full of hubris and ends up coming to bite them in the arse anyway. And it's something that ultimately does so. He gives his brother a quirk that his frail body can actually handle, one that's supposed to be powerful, but I get the feeling that the reason why he gave him such a powerful quirk was because he knew deep down that his body really couldn't actually handle it. I mean, it could handle having it, but if it was ever to get to its true potential, it would probably kill or severely harm his brother, so it's a power play on him. So at the end of the day, it was a quirk that was powerful, was largely useless to the person he was giving it to, so that's why you have that moment where, after he kills his brother and the other people flee, that he's not immediately panicked or worried by the idea that he can't find traces of the quirk in his brother's dead body. I mean, when he realises what's really going on, then he starts to panic, but up until that particular moment, he doesn't seem that bothered. You see him there in the skyscraper thing having his dinner, and he is reflecting on it and doesn't seem that bothered by it until he realises, oh crap, somehow he's passed it on. And from there, we see the extent of the punishment that he gives to the second user of All For One. bloody and he just kills everybody. He kills everybody connected to this guy. Anyone in his family, anyone he's ever known, anyone who's friends with him, everyone that's friends with his friends, anyone that could ever be possibly connected to him whatsoever. My God, all for one, just eat a Snickers or something and calm down, for God's sake. And this ends up playing more into the sheer hubristic paranoia that he develops, because he starts to wonder, is Bakugo in some way related to this guy? I'm going to be honest, I don't think he is. It's just an attitude thing. He just has a similar vibe to him, and that just ends up further enforcing All For One's paranoia and his desire for revenge. He's getting so emotionally invested into the moment that it's starting to break him down. He's getting so consumed by his own emotions that it's dulling his judgment, and it's putting him into such a vulnerable position. This whole episode, for the most part, is just this parade of utter darkness, and in certain elements almost uncharacteristically dark given this series, but this is a series, as I've said throughout my time reviewing it, I think is far darker than a lot of people give it credit for, but it's more dark on a societal level, on a structural level. It doesn't really necessarily lean into dark images in quite the way that this one does. This is an episode that shows a newly born or recently born baby. Jesus Christ, I don't even think I could describe what this is, but you've seen the episode, you know what happens. So, yeah. And it does, I find it amazing that the emotional significance of the spikes that we've seen from him. Because I will admit, there were times whenever we've seen him put the spikes onto his body for whatever reason, or to use them, where it always felt like, okay, we're leaning a bit too hard on the cliches of the villain design. Oh, they're gonna have spikes, they're gonna have horns, but now there is an emotional reason as to why they're there, because that is the first quirk that he stole. It was his mother's quirk, who, from what I understand, there's more to her backstory discussed in the manga, but I think it's just a way of explaining how she came to be pregnant with the twins, is what we'll say. As I don't want to lean on anything, because we know what YouTube's like these days. I mean, hell, this is a channel that has been stuck at 160 subscribers. We break it, then a couple weeks later we end up going back to 160 or lower, so God help us all. I mean, I had a hope that I'd get to 170 subscribers by the end of this year. I don't think that's happening, but back to the story at hand. I will say is that this title is one that it's another double entendre. It's another thing with double meaning. It says Quirk Explosion. That's the title of it. Whilst this is a reflection of Bakugo and what happens in the latter half of this episode, and there was a part of me when I learned what the title was expecting, oh, are we really going to go through another thing where explain what Bakugo's explosion quirk is? Like, we're going to explain to us in a way like he's just appeared on the show for the first time. But no, we don't get that, and whilst it is ultimately the solution to the problem, it also reflects the time period that happens in the first half of this episode, because this first half of this episode takes place during the Quirk emergence period. It takes place during a time where there was a great Quirk explosion. Granted, they weren't calling them Quirks back then, because whoever the hell's grandma didn't come up with the name for it, because that's the thing, because that's I'm your brother's cousin's sister's brother's former roommate weird connection to all of this with this series, but nonetheless, that the Quirk Explosion title again refers to both Bakugo but also the time period in which Quirks exploded onto the scene, and that from a certain point of view, All For One exploded onto the scene. Like, I'm not 100% sure, because they do make reference to the glowing baby frequently in this time period, in the flashback period. I might have misread it, I might be misunderstanding it, but there's a part of me that wonders if he didn't steal the glowing power from the Illuminous baby. I mean, we get the little bit where it says, oh, the Illuminous person is putting out a plea to everyone to calm down and stop being so hateful. So I suppose from a certain point of view, they became almost like a spiritual leader, if not a spiritual leader, then certainly a community leader for people that have meta abilities. And I get the feeling that maybe, he was giving a speech in India at the time, and that's when All For One struck. I mean, it's a possibility, or he got one very similar to it for the similar kind of just emotional weight of it, that he is this dark reflection of what quirks are. That he isn't this bright, luminous, and hopeful thing, that he's now taken the hope and the illumination and turned it into something darker. Which is... I don't know what I have to say with all of that. The whole stuff, that whole first half of the episode, I think is wonderfully dark. I wish we'd have got more from it, but that's something I'll discuss later on. Of course, when all that stuff is done and dusted, we get to the latter half of the episode, which is the big final battle between All For One and Bakugo. And I say battle, let's be honest, it's less of a battle and more of a quick draw, like you'd expect to see in an old spaghetti western or something. It's not necessarily about one character being more powerful than the other, it's more so that one has better reflexes than the other, or one's power is broken enough to be broken enough to defeat the other one. This is a desperate last stand by both of them. This is repeated by the fact that this is the dying episode of the moments of the episode itself. Both of them are totally maimed. Both of them are totally broken down. Both of them are having to make a last stand. This is All For One's last chance to get to Toma in time to try and maybe, just maybe, be able to fuse with Toma and get his big final victory. But he's only got one shot to do this, and Bakugo, likewise, has only got one shot to do this. And all of this is as wonderfully animated as you could want it to, with the emotional impact, which for me overshadows the quality of the animation, as this feels like the full rounding off as Bakugo as a character, because we get that line of, it isn't your story, it's ours, and I think that's wonderful. There was a part of me that was worried that he'd say, it isn't your story, it's mine, which I'm glad that he didn't, because it ends up showing how he's evolved as a character, and now he's seeing his peers as being his peers. And it shows how he sees not just himself, but his classmates and Midoriya. It shows just how much he has grown as a character. Oh, I'm sure that in other material, if there's spin-offs, or that Bakugo movie actually is made, that we'll see him as being as sparking, as animated as he has been. But at the very least, he is matured, and he's maturing as a character, and this is a great flag moment to underline that. He is maturing as All For One grows immature. And in this episode, we get a semi-confirmation that All For One, getting younger, is twisting his judgment. That as the younger he gets, the more rash and irrational that he's getting. Not just limiting the amount of quirks he can use for his final gambit, but it's affecting his judgment. He's being more emotional, and he's letting his emotions overpower him and overtake him and make him weaker and put him into a position where he's going to end up losing of this. It's amazing how this went from a battle of survival to our heroes to being a battle of survival for All For One. One he's already in the process of losing due to the fact that this youth, this regeneration of him, is undermining him. And we get that fantastic line from, I don't remember, it's the Vestiges of One For All, or from Hawk's his vestige, and the rest of them talking about how he's been consumed by Toma, and just the look of sheer horror on his face is great. And the sheer amount of cope that he has to throw into himself, trying, no, I can still win this, if I can get closer to him, then I can teleport in, I'm gonna do this, oh my god. I love that, just the sheer panic and desperation from a character that isn't known from doing that. I think it's great, and it just shows just how utterly spectacularly this has all fallen apart for him. And at the end of the day, it's fallen apart for him due to him. The use of the healing bullet thing, the thing that's made with blood from Aries' quirk, that's the thing that did it. If he hadn't have done that, had he not gone down that path, he probably could have survived all of it. Like, they weren't going to kill him, they were just going to barbecue him. Then he could have come back healed up at some point in the future. But he didn't. At the end of the day, he was hoisted by his own petard. He was blown up by his own explosives. And in a dark way, this might be a controversial point to say, I do like how this episode ends. Not just by the fact that All For One is consumed by his own hubris and it wipes him out in the end, but it's the fact of you have that moment where, as All For One is dying and is fading away, you get all the vestiges like fading away and you get the narrator saying, all the stolen powers return to their original users. Well, it didn't, but wouldn't that be nice? I like how miserable that is, because there's a part of you thinking for a moment, oh, so that's how it's going to work. Everyone who's lost the power that's still alive is going to get their quirk in. Oh, isn't that? Oh, it isn't. That isn't happening. Oh, okay, well... like, I like the miserableness of it, but at the end of the day, you know, Eri can revert people and heal them now, so I suppose it's not a permanent thing, but nonetheless, you know, I like how miserable that is. Like, it's just this weird bittersweetness. Well, it's not weirdly bittersweet, it is just a bittersweetness that, on the one hand, you're happy that this big, nasty bad guy is ultimately defeated, ultimately by his own hand, and also Bakugo blasting the hell out of him, and him, again, at the end of the episode, having another quick draw moment between himself and Bakugo, this absolute last-minute stand. He had time either to take down Bakugo or to flee, and he tries to take down Bakugo, and it doesn't end up work for him. And at the end of the day, he is hoisted up by his own petard. He is brought down by his own hubris. And I like that fact. I like that's how the way that ultimately this character was brought down. This great mastermind could not overcome his own emotions, and that ultimately got the better of him. With that said, however, let us get into the negatives, and first off, I was promised someone nuking a baby, and I didn't get it! Alright, full disclosure, I knew that at some point or another in the final episodes of this series, there was going to be some moment where a baby was going to get blown up, and I didn't know if this was going to be some kind of abstract, like, vestige realm thing, or there was something else to it, and that's not what we got! That isn't what we got. Circumstances were different. Maybe it's different entirely in the manga, but nonetheless, you know, that's not... I'm going to be honest, this isn't a real negative. This isn't a real negative, because at the end of the day, I like the way it ended up going, and I don't think Bakugo blowing up a baby was really the way that they could have ended it, because in the end, I like the way that it goes here, where ultimately it's all for one just being so self-driven to try and get some petty revenge on someone in the dying moments is the thing that ultimately ends up doing for him. Well, it's not just petty revenge. He knows that Bakugo's not going to let him pass one way or the other, but regardless, you get the idea. The big problem I do have with the episode is the fact I think the All For One backstory stuff should have been its own thing. It does feel as though it's almost like scene missing from certain moments, like how we get from the younger brother being found to them fleeing. It feels like only a matter of moments. Was it only a matter of moments? Was it something that came after several days or weeks? We don't know. It feels as though there are gaps in that story that could have been shown and could have been told out and could have expanded it out. And then you could have ended the episode with the whole almost quick draw aspect, and then you get into that big final fight with a dedicated thing between Bakugo and All For One. We didn't get that. But I will admit that as far as negatives are concerned, this is an episode I have very few issues with. Oh, sure, the matters of survival for the baby All For One towards the start of all of this. Oh, sure, that's a little bit much, but I'm willing to suspend my disbelief because that's not the thing we're supposed to be taking from it. We're supposed to be taking from it, oh, bloody hell, that's a bit dark. With all that said, however, let us get into the overview and say that I think that this is a fantastic episode. There are certain elements of it, like I say, which don't quite add up to me. But it is one of those, it's the Mystery Science Theatre thing of, just to repeat to yourself that it's just a show and I really should relax. And at the end of the day, it's not a breaking of disbelief to the point where it undermines the episode, because I still think the episode itself is great. And there's a part of me that now wouldn't mind a series that is based around the early Quirk emergence period. I don't think we'll ever get that, but nonetheless, it was good to see how all those things evolved, and so see how All For One built up his movement, and you had Dr. War Crimes in the crowd of it going, oh, now my bullshit theory about Quirk Doomsday is going to have legitimacy, woohoo, and all that stuff. I like the episode. It is the kind of miserable that I enjoy for reasons I'll never understand. With all that said and done, let's get to Comment Corner. It's time for Comment Corner. 2 comments for this week. First one comes from Big X1, who says, I was waiting to see how they do this moment on the show. It was worth the wait. Thank you for recommending this. I was referring to the previous episode with Bakugo going hell for leather to take, I was going to say Tomura down, but no, All For One down. And yes, that episode was brilliant and amazing and great, and I really did enjoy it. And next we have Scott TV Gamer, who says, initially I didn't really like the idea of people's hopes and wishes being enough to change the future night I saw in Season 4, but I'm glad I wasn't it wasn't a one-time thing. Props to Horikoshi. I'm sorry if I get the name wrong for consistency, I suppose. Next week, we'll adapt two of my favourite chapters, not just the art, but the whole series. The preview looks promising. I'm not sure we'll get another whole episode of this quality again, but one scene next week definitely has the potential to surpass everything we got today. Oh, and similarly to the first episode, I have a feeling that you might not like the title much. It's probably the best option they could have went with. Thank you for your comment. And yeah, I don't hate the title. As I mentioned earlier in the review, I do appreciate the title because I think that there is more to it, because it is Quirk Explosion. It's not just Quirk Explosion. This is a Quirk Explosion. This is a Quirk that it does explosives, but it also reflects the whole birth of the Quirk period, the explosion of quirks upon the world. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that stuff, but hey ho, that wasn't the focus of it. It was about All For One being a horrible, shitty baby. But anyway, let me know what you think about this episode down in the comment section down below. Let me know what you thought about it. Let me know if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. And see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!